Good morning, gentlemen. I'm back for another session of my channel, and this time I'm going to discuss what's happening in Ukraine. Why Ukraine? Because Ukraine is the hotspot of the world where a matchstick could lead to a nuclear conflagration. Now, the Russians had attacked Ukraine, and there are valid reasons for it, which we have discussed earlier. They felt threatened with the expansion of NATO, which was deliberate, and the purpose was to keep Russia perpetually under tension and lose any aspiration they had of being a global power. And that's all over. The war has commenced, and now a couple of months have elapsed. By now, the Russians should have overrun the entire country, but they haven't made significant headway, and that is something which we have to accept. Having captured some territory in the Donbas region and the failure to capture Kiev and Kharkiv are very telling aspects of the Russian military operations. Now, people have asked me why couldn't the Russians overrun Ukraine, which didn't have much of a power, Well, the facts are very simple. The Russians did not plan this invasion properly. They thought it's a cakewalk. You just walk in and the Ukrainians are going to surrender. It's not going to happen that way. Because this is global politics for world domination, the Americans are not going to allow this to happen, wherein Russia becomes the omnipotent power in Europe. Now, when we come to that conclusion, the Americans and the West were bound to intervene. And this is where Putin should have anticipated it. Zelensky, for all his faults, knew that he had the backing of the Americans and the British, and he continued opposing the Russians. The entire problem could have been solved within 5 minutes if the Ukrainian president had agreed not to join NATO, not to join EU, and not to become a bulwark against Russia. He didn't do that because he was confident, and that confidence has rubbed off. The Russians didn't anticipate it, and they just walked into Ukraine. And I have pointed out earlier also, in any war, the theory of Goliath the Huth, the father of strategic air force bombing, must be borne in mind. What he says air power is decisive, and this is where the Russians faltered. They never bombed Ukraine even for one day like the Americans, who bombed Kosovo for almost 60 days and Iraq for 70 days before invading. Russians did nothing. They just walked in. You don't walk in like you walk into a drawing room. And then the resistance picked up. Weapons were supplied to the Ukrainians, and they fought. They've been losing. They're losing about 100 men every day, but then they're still fighting. And the Russians have not been able to make headway that they would have liked to make. All over the world, military theorists, people like me, have been wondering what really went wrong with the Russian invasion. I've already pointed out it was complacency. And now, when Putin woke up to this fact and decided to put his weapons, they made some gains. They are slowly moving forward. But it's slow. I mean, it's got no relevance really. They have not yet been able to capture Odisha. They have not been able to capture Kharkiv. And just capturing one or two seaports or something doesn't mean that victory is assured. You may have won the battle but not the war, and the war will continue. Now, if the war continues, what are the repercussions? That is the very important point. The Western powers are playing with fire, there is no doubt about it. And they hope to emasculate Russia economically so badly that the Russians will themselves say, we give up. Now, in the recent G20 conference, which was held in Southeast Asia, all the Western powers ganged up against the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov, and he had no choice but to withdraw. This is all very well politically to try and isolate Russia. Another aspect where they wanted to put pressure is usually when the head of the American consulate in Mumbai sent a letter to the Bombay Port Trust chairman to stop Russian ships from coming to the Bombay port. The letter was ignored by the Indians, and later on perhaps the Americans also realized that they have bitten off more than they can chew. So all these attempts are there to try and sap Russia, the blood out of the Russian system economically, but it's not happening. The Russian ruble has rebounded, mainly because of steps taken by the Russian central bank, where they said they will trade only in rubles. And Russia is an export surplus country as far as oil and natural gas is concerned, and this is required by all the countries of Western Europe, including Germany, France, all of them. So when they were putting all these sanctions on Russia, they themselves were also feeling the effect of the sanctions. Like if you light a fire, you're going to burn also, and that's what's happening. But the Americans are relentless because the American economy is so strong, it can sustain anything. They can sustain anything. It's a 20 trillion economy with a population of just 325 million. You can see what the GDP per capita works out to. Tremendous. So they can stand, they can sustain. But I'm not sure with the East European and the West European nations will be able to stand, because they have no natural resources, nothing. No oil, no gas, and in the present world these are two quantities which you need, and Russia had been supplying their needs so far, but now the Russians have turned off the tap, and that has made these countries more desperate, and they are trying extreme measures. The best course of action would be to negotiate with the Russians, accept whatever they are saying, and then go ahead and say, well, let's move forward. But it's not happening that way, as we have seen in the G20 meeting, and now in the coming heads of state meeting of the G20 again, where Putin will also attend. I think the same sort of system is going to follow. All these Western powers are going to gang up, and then the only country standing with Russia is China. North Korea, which is inconsequential, and Cuba, these are no meaning. India is sitting on the fence, and that is not good. Not good for the Indians. And I will just venture and say that India should not fall into the American trap at all. India should not forget that America has never supported India against Pakistan. Never. And not only that, our foreign minister realized it when he said that if the Americans had not been supporting Pakistan, the Kashmir problem would have been solved. They brought in so many resolutions in the Security Council against the Indians, recommending a plebiscite in Kashmir, which were vetoed by the Russians. So India is grateful to the Russians. And even in 71 war, President Nixon sent the 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal. Of course, that fleet wouldn't have achieved anything, because the war ultimately was lost completely, because the Pakistan army could not fight, demoralized, their leadership was bankrupt. Yahya Khan was just running around doing all sorts of things which you don't expect a general or a president to do. I won't say what it is. But the net result was Pakistan lost despite the American help. And America would have won the Vietnam War or the Afghanistan War in case they had not pandered to the whims of the Pakistan leadership. Now all this background is there, so that's what I am bringing out, that India should be very careful and wary of how they deal with the Americans. You cannot rely on the Americans. If you could run away from Afghanistan, Vietnam, any other place, Iran, how can you really rely on the Americans? Tomorrow they'll make peace with China and they say, okay, bye-bye India. They left Chiang Kai-shek in the lurch after being with him for 30 years. he didn't know what to do after that when Richard Nixon accepted the one China policy. Similarly, coming to Ukraine, it's a different kettle of fish altogether, because the Americans and the West is confronted by a leader who's very strong and nationalist, and he's Vladimir Putin. I think his ideal is Joseph Stalin, and he's trying to mold himself into that. But Stalin had a lot of plus points, and Putin is not on that level, and that part I will accept, But all the same, he's making an attempt, and that attempt is to confront the United States and not give in. He's not giving in, despite the fact that his military has made very slow and progress in Ukraine. Now, what happens next? What are we going to do? If the Americans are going to tweak the Russians more, they are going to suffer, the Western powers will suffer, and that may lead to an act of desperation. The Russians could do something so drastic that there would be no going back. I mean, then the next stage is only the Stone Age. So, this is where statesmanship is required, which unfortunately Biden clouded by the thinking which his generals had. Now, how about the American general staff? Let me tell you, they've been brought up or rather fed on a diet of anti-Sovietism. They haven't got out of that frame of mind that Soviet Russia has gone. They still feel Russia is the enemy, and they created the enemy so that NATO could survive. But when you make artificial creations, they collapse, and already the NATO is under a lot of pressure. I mean, they haven't intervened in Ukraine, and though they have accepted the membership of Sweden and Finland, I don't think they are going to intervene for them in case the Russians move against them. And even the small Baltic states, I mean, I wonder if they realize that it just requires 1 or 2 thermonuclear bombs to wipe them off the world map. That includes England. Now, we are coming to the situation where the Russians might get desperate. Desperate because how long can the Russians really fight on? That is the crucial question. The Americans could fight on for 12 years because of the economy in Afghanistan. They fought for 9 years in Vietnam. Their economy could stand it. But the Russian economy is not that strong, and they are in some trouble. So either they have a quick solution, and they are using now the latest rockets and air bombardment, but it's come too late. Had they started this from day one, by now the war would have been over. It has given time to Zelensky to marshal his forces, get the help from the Americans, and beef up his defense. The only possibility is that in case there is a complete collapse of morale of the Ukrainian army, and we haven't got any information on that at the moment, at least I don't have at the moment. They are still fighting, and they fought, but thousands have been taken prisoner. That also is a fact. So what are we going to happen now? And I personally feel that by the actions of the Western powers, they are moving every day closer and closer to a nuclear war. You can't run with the hare, hunt with the hound, and say that, well, I'm everything fine, You can't have peace with Russia at detente and at the same time keep putting sanctions, economic, God knows what all sanctions on Russia, and try to isolate Russia from the world. And I can tell you the Americans are going to fail in this, because the world is not going to toe the American line lock, stock and barrel. No. That being the case, they need a president who can think ahead, because economic power is up to a level, and now the Americans are marshalling all the countries against Russia. But things are not working their way. Iran is defying them, and now I understand they are going to supply the air warfare drones which are made in Iran to Russia. Iran is not a great technological power, but probably they have perfected this particular device. And Israel also is worried about Iran. So Biden has just made a visit to Israel and Saudi Arabia. He's eaten all his words, when he was talking earlier that he would see that the Khashoggi murder case is handled and everything. It just about shows he's a man without any morals, a totally bankrupt individual. Here's a man who was talking a lot against Saudi Arabia in the Khashoggi murder case, and also had stopped the weapon export to Saudi Arabia for the actions in Yemen. But he changed turtle because his one aim is now to try and contain Russia. It's not going to be easy. Russia is the biggest country in the world, and China is also wary of the Americans, and they are on the side of the Russians. So you are going to have a fight. Probably what I think is the American thinking is that Russia can be destroyed and then we can have an accommodation with China. It's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. China is not going to make any accommodation till they are the number one power in the world, like they were during the Middle Ages when China was known as the Central Kingdom. Everyone went to China. The days of the Opium War, the Boxer Rebellion, all that is over. It's got no meaning now. And similarly, the Americans must draw the history of Russia from the time of Napoleon. Russians never say surrender. And if they think the Russians are going to say, okay, well, we give up, it's not going to happen. So the next step is only, Putin has already said, and his generals have been talking, that they don't mind a nuclear scrap. And what are the consequences of that? I've already discussed in my earlier videos. The complete annihilation of the small countries in Europe. America will survive, yeah, but England and all these countries are just going to vanish. So, gentlemen, I have to end this topic, this video, on a sobering note that I hope sanity prevails on the US President and the West, and they have an accommodation with Russia. Stop trying to pump up Mr. Zelensky, and he should be handed over to an international tribunal as a war criminal. After all, if you could try the Japanese leaders for starting a world war, there is no reason why you can't Zelensky for having dragged his nation into a war and destroyed it. And what has he gained out of it? God save him. I close now, gentlemen. Farewell till we meet again. I hope you like this video. Share it, like it. And I close now. Jai Hind. God bless you all.